It's 3:30 in the morning here in the capital, Tehran. You're watching Press TV's Top 5. Many thanks for joining us this hour. Now, Russia and China have vetoed a UN resolution that was jointly proposed by New Zealand, Spain and Egypt for a 7-day ceasefire in Syria's flashpoint city of Aleppo. 11 members of the Security Council voted in favor of the draft resolution. Apart from Russia and China, Venezuela also voted against the motion. Angola, however, abstained from voting. Meanwhile, Russia's envoy to the UN has argued that a ceasefire in the war-ravaged Syria would allow foreign-backed militants to regroup and rearm.
In the current draft resolution, what it talks about is not a withdrawal of fighters from eastern Aleppo, but rather an immediate cessation of hostilities. At the same time, fighters will have 10 days to determine whether they will become whether they will be parties to the cessation of hostilities or not. As we know, these kinds of force to their ammo and to strengthen their positions, and this will only worsen the suffering of civilians. The Russian Federation cannot support this.
Chergin also called for consistency from the U.S. in resolving the Syria crisis. He accused Washington of toppling negotiations on the war-ravaged Arab country. For its part, the U.S. put the onus of the blame on Moscow, saying Russia is delaying action over Syria at the 15-member UN Security Council. Meanwhile, Syria's UN envoy has slammed the U.S., the U.K., and France and some of their regional allies for their support of terrorism in Syria.
From the very first days of the terrorist war imposed on my country, Syria, the United States, France, and Britain, that indeed deserve the name of the three musketeers defending terrorism. Those three states, in addition to other states outside this council, Turkey, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia, that call for formal, informal meetings and very informal consultations in various formats, that table resolutions one after the other in a way that has led the United Nations to leave its most important principles and purposes in defending international peace and security.
Jafari accused the West and its regional backers of making attempts to prop up terrorists in Syria. He then alleged that Washington, Paris, and London are taking a double standard while dealing with the Syrian conflict, turning a blind eye to the suffering of the civilians. The Syrian diplomat added that such action manifests itself vividly when the killing of civilians in Yemen goes unnoticed by the Western powers and their allies. Bashar al-Ja'fari also pledged that the Syrian army would continue fighting until it completely annihilates terrorists from the country. To discuss this further, let's speak to Mimi Al-Laham. She's a Syrian activist and political commentator, and she joins us via Skype from Australia. Many thanks for joining us here on Press TV, Ms. Al-Laham. Now, first of all, I'd like to get your opinion as far as the statements made by both the Russian envoy to the UN as well as the Syrian envoy, saying that the U.S. has basically is trying to ensure that these terrorist groups in Aleppo are able to regroup and rearm through such calls for ceasefires.
Well, that's basically been evident every time there has been a ceasefire. The US and its allies, France, UK, the GCC countries, have used it to rearm and sort of give a break to the rebels. And this has been done with negotiations with Russia. Russia agrees to this, basically, knowing that that's going to happen, but with some concessions provided to it by the US, whatever those may be. But Russia has been doing this for a while now, making these ceasefire agreements. But finally, the US broke the ceasefire agreement in a very profound way when they attacked the Syrian army in Deir ez-Zor. And since that time, there hasn't been another ceasefire because basically the US is not to be trusted. So at this point, there's no need for a ceasefire because it's clear that victory is very near for Syria and its allies, Russia and Iran, in Aleppo. And basically, there's no hope for the US's Al-Qaeda militants to regain Aleppo. So there's nothing to talk about anymore in terms of ceasefires.
Well, Ms. Al-Laham, the view that is being presented by the US and its allies is that a ceasefire is necessary in Aleppo because it's the civilian lives that are at stake, that the Syrian army is basically conducting its operation to liberate Aleppo of liberation at any cost, and resulting in massive civilian casualties. What would you say to that?
You know, if human casualties were a concern, then the US would be trying to make a ceasefire in Mosul with ISIS. If human casualties were a concern, the US would be trying to create a ceasefire in Yemen, which Saudi Arabia is currently bombing quite, to the point of complete collapse. So the human rights, humanitarian concerns, that is a secondary objective. What the US wants is to have its influence in Syria remain there, which is unfortunately the terrorists in Aleppo that they control, and to some degree. And that is why they want a ceasefire in Aleppo. The civilians, they are exiting now en masse. As the Syrian army controls rebel-held areas, they're finally able to be free and leave the east of Aleppo. The only civilians now that are remaining perhaps are the rebel families, or perhaps are civilians that haven't been allowed to leave by the rebels. This is what needs to be addressed. The fact that civilians aren't being allowed to leave by the rebels. The fact that rebels are firing on civilians that are trying to escape. That is something that we need to be discussing in the United Nations. Not a ceasefire with Al-Qaeda, and certainly not power sharing with Al-Qaeda.
All right, let's leave it there for now. That's Mimi Al-Laham, Syrian activist and political commentator, joining us via Skype from Australia. Ms. Al-Laham, thank you very much indeed for your comments here on Press TV.